Welcome to this session of AIJC 2020. Just some quick housekeeping before we start. There is translation in this session, so choose your language. Go to the global icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on English or French and mute the main channel so you only get one sound channel. You will see Roy Blumenthal on the screen. He is our resident caricaturist and sketchnoter working live during the session, and you'll see his work from time to time or certainly at the end of the session. Please use the Q&A function for your questions or comments, and the facilitator will pick them up from there. Have a great session.
Good evening. Welcome to the Cardoso Memorial Lecture 2020. This lecture is normally done as a more formal single lecture where we focus on one country and look at the situation there. The idea of this lecture is to promote solidarity and awareness of the situation of journalists across Africa and encourage us all to identify, show solidarity, and be more aware of the situation in different countries. Tonight, we do it differently. We are looking at 4 countries because I think that under the pandemic and under restrictions we find ourselves, we think that that virtual contact as wide as possible is extremely important. We are gathered to honor and to remember a journalist, as you saw, of brave and independent spirit, who was assassinated for investigating corruption. And let me just tell you a bit about him and why we host this lecture at Wits University. The university hosts this Solidarity Lecture to remember a graduate, because he did his first degree here, who fought for media freedom in this region, across the region, and who gave his life for it. This year, we're also joined by the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, the New York-based CPJ, as co-hosts, and we thank them for their support and participation. We know what important work they do to protect journalists on our continent, and we're very pleased to be working and linking up with them. A bit about Carlos. Carlos was born in Mozambique, but came to school here in Witbank, just outside Johannesburg. And then in 1973, he enrolled at this university to study the humanities. And as you will recall, 1973 was a very significant year for his country, Mozambique, and for the whole region. And he quickly became prominent on this campus as a vocal and passionate anti-apartheid and anti-colonial campaigner. He was elected to the Wits SRC in 1975, and once in office, he was vocal in his support for Frelimo, which had taken power in Mozambique. And that was a brave position to take in apartheid South Africa, which was deeply hostile to the Frelimo government. It wasn't long, late 1975, security police raided Carlos's flat in nearby Braamfontein, just down the road from where we stand tonight here in Joburg, arrested him. 24 hours later, they deported him to Maputo. The university, I'm proud to say, gave him a special and unusual dispensation to finish his degree there. On his return home, Cardoso became a junior reporter on a weekly newspaper, Tempo, then joined Radio Mozambique in '78. 2 years later, very quickly, he became director of Mozambique's government news agency, AIM. But he was a Frelimo supporter, but he was also a critical Frelimo supporter. 1982, he incurred the wrath of the then President Samora Machel by running a story on the rebel movement Renamo, bringing the issue into the public for the first time. And for this expose, he was sent to jail for 6 days. But I'm pleased to say that Samora Machel later came to respect, trust Carlos enough to bring him into a select inner circle of journalists in Maputo. Devastated by Machel's death in an air crash in 1986, Cardoso criticized Frelimo by writing that so many senior people in his ranks no longer served any interests but their own personal ones. He began to push for a more independent, robust media within Mozambique, and this led to a growing tension between him and the government. 1989, exhausted and depressed, he resigned as director of AIM, frustrated by a lack of media freedom, dropped out of journalism. The good news came in 1992 when Mozambique passed media freedom laws, new media freedom laws, and opened up the industry for the first time. Cardoso was one of a group of journalists who immediately went and launched a thing called Media Co-op, the first independent publication being Media Fax, a fax newspaper. And Carlos's biographer, Paul Fauvet, said that when Carlos heard that some of the country's best journalists were going to join this venture, he wept with joy. Media Fax was just 4 pages faxed out every night, but it became an instant success as the only independent media voice in that country. According to Fauvet, it was a voice located on the left wing of Frelimo, but quite prepared to denounce government blunders or abuses, and it was sharply written. So he faced a fair amount of pressure and a response from those in power. Carlos also became active in the Together for the City movement in Maputo and won a seat in the city council as an independent candidate. Unusual for a journalist, but Carlos was an unusual journalist. His last editorial before his death was an attack on the city council for failing to provide adequate basic service. But he was also investigating a 1996 corruption scandal at the state-controlled Commercial Bank of Mozambique. It was because of that investigation that on November the 22nd, 2000, Carlos was gunned down in the streets of Maputo. So we gather to remember Carlos not just as a fierce and brave investigative journalist, but one who came to symbolize the spirit of public service, which is at the heart of great journalism. Fauvet, his biographer, wrote, Cardoso came to embody all that was best in Mozambican journalism, all that was honest, questioning, combative. He was admired, respected, and loved, even among those subjected to his withering criticism in his writing. President Chissano said at his funeral, "We are used to arguing with Carlos. We argued with him because he raised pertinent questions that demanded the attention of all of us. He forced us all to think. Today, when he's no longer with us, who else, we ask, who else will raise the questions with the force that raised them, that he raised them?" That phrase, "he forced us all to think," I think that may be the highest praise for a journalist. Anyway, it's fitting that at a conference of investigative journalists from across the continent, we remember a journalist who was killed in the line of duty. I'm going now to hand over to Angela Quintal of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, who will facilitate the rest of the session this evening, and who will introduce our panel of speakers. Angela.
Thank you, Anton, and welcome to our panelists, and also, of course, to all of you, wherever you might be watching on our continent and the world. Just to tell you a bit about the Committee to Protect Journalists, obviously, we were founded in 1981 by a group of US correspondents who realized that they couldn't ignore the plight of their counterparts elsewhere. And the idea really was for journalists from all over the world to come together to defend the rights of colleagues working in repressive environments. And I guess that is what today's annual Cardoso Memorial Lecture is partly about. It's about encouraging solidarity as we spotlight countries where journalists are under attack. Now, it's almost 4 decades later, and CPJ's work is not only in repressive environments, but in established democracies, including the United States, and of course, in conflict zones. CPJ has a team of about 40 experts around the world, supported by a network of correspondents, to do exactly what our name says, to protect journalists so that they can report the news safely and without fear of reprisal. Now, I head the Africa program, and I can tell you that we have never been busier, not only because of COVID-19 and the fact that it is being used as a pretext by some governments to crack down on dissent, but really because conditions for press freedom the world over, not only in Africa, have arguably deteriorated. So today, October 22nd, is the day that Carlos was murdered 20 years ago in Maputo. But it's also the day that we mark the 1-year anniversary of the 4 jailed Iwachu journalists in Burundi who were convicted of anti-state charges simply because they wanted to cover clashes between the security and an armed group in the west of their country. And yesterday was exactly 35 months to this day that a Tanzanian freelance journalist, Azori Gwanda, went missing in 2017. He had been investigating mysterious killings and was last seen in the company of men believed to be intelligence agents. These cases that I've mentioned obviously remain emblematic for CPJ, and we continue to push for justice. But the challenges facing journalists on our continent is not my story to tell. It's obviously those of our 4 speakers who, unlike their governments, understand that journalism is not a crime. Their stories will also shed light on the press freedom environment in their respective countries. So each of them will speak for 10 minutes, and then it'll be followed by a short Q&A session. Our speakers are obviously courageous journalists, journalists who do not have the might, and I think this is important, that they don't have the might of a powerful international news organization behind them. You know, organizations that will give them cover and protection in their work, or for that matter, will help ensure sustained international attention when things go wrong. And this is why we need solidarity from all of you. So first up is Lina Attalah, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Mada Masa, an independent news website in Egypt. Egypt, of course, tops Africa's, or the CPJ's list of Africa's worst jailer of journalists. And Mada Masa is really one of the few sources of independent news in Egypt and has survived the Egyptian government's repression and crackdown on the press. And Lina and her team routinely face government harassment, and they work under they do work under the continued threat of arrest. Lina herself was detained, most recently in May this year. Then Lina's going to be followed by Mozambique's Mateus Quintal, the executive editor of Canal de Mozambique. He has faced official harassment and intimidation in recent years, including an attempted abduction on New Year's Eve, and now, of course, an arson attack in August that destroyed his newspaper's office in Maputo. Mateus is also under investigation for allegedly contravening state security, for publishing information about a security contract between the government and a multinational oil consortium in Cabo Delgado. Now, Cabo Delgado is the province in northern Mozambique that is effectively a no-go area for journalists, thanks to the military fighting Islamist insurgents, and where thousands of Mozambicans have been internally displaced and many killed. a story that unfortunately has been largely ignored by fellow Africans and the international community. We had hoped that we'd be joined by the Republic of Niger's Samira Sabo, but unfortunately she's unable to be here. And I must say, I owe a huge thanks to Tanzanian journalist Ansbert Ngurumo, who agreed to join us at very short notice. Ansbert, who was and remains very critical of President John Magufuli, actually had to flee Tanzania in 2017 after he was tipped off about a plot to kill him. Ansbert now lives in exile in Sweden. He's the founder and editor of a pro-democracy website that continues to publish what he calls forbidden news. But meanwhile, Magufuli's government continues its assault on the media in Tanzania ahead of next week's election. And then finally, we have the founder and editor of Zim Live in Zimbabwe, Mduduzi Matutu. His investigative work with Zim Live news website to expose COVID-19 procurement corruption led to the government canceling $60 million worth of tenders awarded to a friend of the president, of Emerson Mnangagwa's family. And of course, then the arrest of their former health minister. Mduduzi's home in Bulawayo was raided on July 30th. It was in a crackdown ahead of anti-corruption protests nationwide. And Mduduzi remains in hiding to this day. Among those who was arrested, well, not among those, but someone who was actually arrested 2 weeks before that raid on his home was journalist Hopeful Chinono, who collaborated with Mduduzi on exposing COVID-19 procurement corruption. And I think this is something that Lina and Egyptian journalists are also quite well aware of. It's how Mduduzi's family was targeted in an attempt to smoke him out, so to speak. And what happened to his nephew, a journalism student, will shock you. So thank you, shukran, nyabonga, merci, and obrigada. And I think this is when I say, masal khir, Lina, it's over to you.
Thank you, Angela, for this generous introduction. I also feel honored to be speaking at this memorial of such an inspiring journalist. I must say there is a bit of an imposter syndrome because some people paid huge prices for the journalism work they have been doing, so respect for that. So I prepared a quick intervention to get us thinking about some of the things we are going through in Egypt, doing the work that we're doing. I was asked in a class I was giving yesterday, a journalism class, what made me opt to doing journalism in a difficult context like that of Egypt. And for me, the answer goes back to turbulent moments of contentious politics in the streets of Cairo, where I felt the urge to engage through the tools and lenses of journalism, of bearing witness, of shedding light, of giving visibility, of critically analyzing, of finding ways to recreate these historic events in the body of a text that would be circulated through a media outlet. I live in a country where, despite restricted political practice, journalism at different points in time was a space through which we could expose violations, shed light on issues barely seen, give alternative narratives to issues distorted by powerful structures, raise questions of public interest, and open sites of imagination. Despite the fact that I haven't really lived in a place that values the essence of independent journalism, I was lucky to live through moments where the margins for such journalism were possible and did exist. These margins existed in the shadows of the economic opening that happened in Egypt by the authorities, by the government, which allowed private enterprises to engage in media projects, which in turn mainly meant that journalism isn't solely practiced in the terrain of the state. Independent journalism back then was translating cracks and ruptures in the traditional mode of ruling to the wider public and contributing to expanding them at the same time. Having been part of this movement since the beginnings in the early 2000s, I like to think of a journalist as a double agent. Her translation labor as a form of smuggling, the smuggling of politics from sphere to sphere, the smuggling of possibility, the smuggling of unpopular, unwanted, and unthought ideas, especially in ecosystems that make the circulation of such ideas hard. I like to think of journalism like the seamless particles of air that carry both comforting and dangerous thoughts from one place to another. And while today the cracks are fewer and the margins are tighter, there is still a reason to keep going and being somehow, with some sort of a miracle, still in journalism. A craft I'm able to describe today as one of survival, despite all the troubles associated with it. It's a time where the narrative on what is it that is really going on is centralized like never before, engineered like never before. Those who try to whisper a different tune are unequivocally reprimanded. Plenty of legislation and news, anti-terror laws, cybercrime laws, penal codes, plenty of cases and plenty of prisoners. But there is still somewhere a reason to keep going, to keep doing journalism, especially a journalism that's committed to finding truthers, writing stories about these search journeys in sentient and engaging ways, piercing through the noise of hypermediations and sanctions of algorithms on corporately engineered social media. There is still somewhere a reason to keep going here. First and foremost, we're still here. There's the ground on which we stand, which we need to preserve and keep. It isn't only the grounds underneath our own feet, but the broader ones of those who chose to read our work and think through it and engage with it. This is the audience who grew familiar with the possibility of diverse narratives once the media and political sphere opened up relatively in the early 2000s in Egypt. Of course, with the technology enabling it, and now are severed of meaningful conversation, this audience, with the absence of public and civic politics, basically. For the broader space that encompasses us, we keep doing journalism. We know that it's a thorny journey, filled with pressure, threats, fatigue, eventual questioning about the point of it all, but it's also a very stimulating journey, marked by the possibility of reporting, writing, and innovating at a time when it's very hard to do so. The possibility of doing when doing is largely discouraged, and above all, the possibility of doing in community, the possibility of being together when our very assembly is systematically fractured. This is the very essence of Mada Mosr, the media I co-founded in Egypt. Since its birth in 2013, Mada Mosr, the media outlet co-founded by a group of journalists and myself on a whim, has been operating despite different odds. You can argue it is a natality at the most counterintuitive of times. The whim pertains to a political moment in that year that felt very much like the beginning of a doom. And with it came the anxiety of sitting still, not being able to do anything in the face of the doom, confronting it, resisting it, or fleeing it. We didn't want to be unemployed. We didn't want to sit alone with our political depression. We didn't want to withdraw. We wanted to stay with the trouble, to be able to respond and to make kin and lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning, to live and die well with each other in a thick present. And here I'm quoting the words of Donna Haraway. Or other words, in Brechtian sense, we chose to sing about the dark times. Finally, I have started taking an online course recently titled We Will Dance with Mountains, hosted by Nigerian philosopher Bayo Akomolafe. In its introduction, he told us of a path that has nothing to do with victory or defeat. He told us that there are things we must do, sayings we must say, thoughts we must think, that look nothing like the images of success that have so thoroughly possessed our visions of justice. I'm on the job today for these things, for these sayings, thoughts we must do, say, and think without obsessing about what we will become. I'm in the job for the people and communities that keep nourishing each other with keys, signals, references to which we can flex our mental muscles and expand our hearts. In extreme moments of uncertainty and in belief of the revolutions, surprises, transformations that are born out of unpredictability, we are inevitably ready for the impossible. Thank you very much.
Shukran, Lina. Jumbo, Ansbert, it's over to you.
Thank you, Angela, and everybody, and especially for inviting me into this occasion. I should be speaking from Tanzania if the situation was as it was supposed to be, but unfortunately, I'm speaking from exile in Sweden because of what happened and what caused me to leave my country. And speaking of solidarity, I am alive today because some good Samaritans within the journalism fraternity came to my rescue at a time when my life was threatened by the regime in Tanzania. John Magufuli, the president of Tanzania, since 2015, has turned journalism into a crime, which we have to stand up against as a show of protest against his dictatorial position against our job, our profession. Yes, journalists have always been threatened and attacked. These are things that we have experienced since we became journalists. But this time it has been different. In the past 5 years of John Magufuli in power, journalists in Tanzania have suffered more. They have suffered the worst of the attacks in the country's almost 60 years of independence. Even as of today, journalists have become one of the main professional and social groups silently fighting to regain their freedom and independence in Tanzania. The democratic gains that had gradually been achieved since 1992, when plurality and diversity were reintroduced in Tanzania, have been eroded and have failed miserably in just 5 years. Magufuli's despotic rule has successfully but painfully instilled fear in the citizens, including journalists, seriously affecting the quality of journalism and the credibility of journalists. Repressive laws and regulations have made independent, objective, and analytical journalism impossible. As a result, the media has abandoned its watchdog role, mainly ending up as the government cheerleader, as a survival mechanism. But of course, they don't even survive. They have not been able to survive. The approach has adversely affected the media industry and the society in which it operates. Critical media houses have been closed, banned, or heavily punished for trivial errors or for crossing the line of the government's patience. A number of journalists have become victims of abduction, torture, framed up court charges, and arbitrary disappearances, as a number of senior journalists have quietly quit the profession. The majority of them, for the sake of survival, have opted to compromise professional integrity in order to coexist with the brutal regime. As I put it in my recent book, John Magufuli, an epitome of cowardice, this fear, mainly imposed by the president himself, has led to serious censorship, making the media lose their nose for useful tips and punchy angles. I would like to emphasize that it's not their fault. As such, the media in Tanzania is not to blame for what is happening in the country. The journalists are obviously abiding the adage that goes, no story is worth your life. On their own, one of our own, just as Angela mentioned, Azori Gwanda, who used to report from an Anchi newspaper, was abducted on November 21st, 2017. Despite global calls for his release, there is no sign of his return. Tanzania's Foreign Minister Palamagamba Kabudi once spoke consciously that Azori was dead. That was in an interview with the BBC, but following strong public criticism, he retracted his statement, but the damage was done. It did not help to diffuse the people's feelings about the journalists who had been abducted and probably killed by the infamous known in Tanzania as watu wasiojulikana, meaning the unknown people, under whose ruthless hands tens of people have suffered and disappeared in the past 5 years. Without global voices come to his rescue, Eric Kabendera, one of my colleagues, an independent freelance journalist who used to report for some Western media, would have gone the Gwanda way mid last year, when his abduction was foiled following a strong public outcry through social media. The regime allegedly said he had a citizenship query to answer. When he proved them wrong within a few hours of the state allegations, they framed up charges of money laundering and economic crimes in order to deny him bail and keep him behind bars indefinitely. He remained in jail for several months until his and family got him out through a plea bargain loophole. There are more such incidents in Tanzania. Now, coming to myself, I'm a lucky survivor of an abduction and assassination incident that had been planned in early October 2017. But since then, I've been in exile, thanks to good Samaritans who tipped me and those who assisted me in several ways to relocate several times beyond the borders of Tanzania to safer locations. This explains why I'm here in Scandinavia, not in East Africa. So Magufuli's regime has made authentic journalism impossible in Tanzania. Cheerleading and propaganda are slowly becoming the order of the day. The quality of journalism has been seriously compromised, and researchers have shown there is a need to establish both Pan-African and global initiatives in order to salvage journalism in Tanzania. The journalism fraternity must bear the moral responsibility of supporting Tanzanian journalists during these times of peril. Where local journalists fail to cover important stories in their vicinity for fear of retaliation from the regime, the foreign media should find a way of exposing the same. At a personal level, in attempting to be part of the solution, I established Sauti Kubwa blog as a creative initiative to circumvent Tanzania's repressive laws. We need more similar initiatives supported by local and international efforts. Where mainstream media have been muzzled, we must find ways of employing social media platforms to do this. We must empower both the journalists and the society who live at the receiving end of the state's violence. Without independent journalism, Tanzania will become a breeding ground for grand corruption. Only independent and authentic journalism can salvage the once stable and peaceful nation from plunging into a very deep abyss of dictatorship, which will not bode well for the future of Southern Africa and Africa as a whole. Tanzanian journalists are facing many hurdles. They must be assisted to investigate the apparently grand corruption hidden in the mega projects executed by the topmost officials of the executive. The Tanzanian media must be assisted to expose the ills that are hidden in the benevolent actions of the president as he silences all actors in the fight against corruption. The journalist professional organizations in Tanzania have been infiltrated by the ruling party and the state agents with the intent to turn them into toothless barking dogs. Instead of working to protect the interests of their members, they are becoming the gatekeepers of the state against critical journalism. It's not an easy task to revive them in the short run, but something must be done by regional compatriots, because Tanzanian journalists cannot be left alone. They can never be left to walk alone in these scary times of Magufuli's iron fist rule. Let us help them to do what they can do best for the sake of Tanzania and Africa. Thanks for listening to me.
Asante sana, Ansbert. Let's move straight to Mduduzi. Thanks very much. Please go ahead.
Good evening. May I just start by expressing my appreciation to the organizers of this Carlos Cardoso Memorial Lecture for this invitation to speak about my situation. I know from past speakers over the years that you don't just get invited here. You must have gone through some kind of trouble, or you must be running from something that's after your life. And usually it's the powerful politicians and their agents who don't value the transparency that investigative journalism shines on their corrupt, illicit activities. I really wish we were meeting under different circumstances. I've not been able to return to my home after me. When they couldn't find me, they took my sister. And simultaneously, as this was happening, they abducted 3 of my nephews, 2 of whom later turned up at the police station, and one of them was returned after 3 days. He was badly hurt, and his kidneys were barely functioning. Then who came to my house were carrying a sham search and seizure warrant, which accused me of organizing and advocating for illegal demonstrations against the government of Zimbabwe. It further stated that I was manufacturing, storing, and distributing to members of the public some materials for use during illegal demonstrations that were planned for July 31. This warrant empowered the state agents to seize my phones, cameras, computers, and any other subversive materials, it said. Of course, there was nothing of the kind happening at my home. I'm not a politician, I'm just a journalist. My nephew, who was abducted and tortured for some 3 days, would later tell me that his captors wanted to know specifically who funds ZimLive, the news website that I edit. My nephew was abducted and tortured for some 3 days. When he was finally released, badly tortured and barely able to walk, told me, he described to me the nature of the discussions, the interrogation that he went through. And his interrogators wanted to know who is funding ZimLive, the news website which I edit. They also wanted to know whom were my contacts in government. Presumably, there is a suspicion there that somebody in government was leaking some information to us. They also wanted to know my sources of information, and also as well as my friends in the media. And of course, they had a question about, which is quite typical of these regimes. They thought that I must have a handler at the British Embassy or the American Embassy. The true intentions of this raid on my house on the 30th of July was never any political threat that I posed to the government of Zimbabwe, which is well armed and has demonstrated repeatedly that it will use those arms to stay in power. Having reviewed as well all the information available to me, I'm convinced that they came after me for exposing corruption, going all the way up to President Emmerson Mnangagwa's doorstep. Back in April, I started an investigation into a company called Drugs International. It's not always that all great investigations begin with a dump of documents. Sometimes you just have to keep a sharp ear, maintain a sharp ear, and I believe I did that. So it so happened that Drugs International's country representative, a man called Delish Nguaya, appeared alongside the president to make a donation for COVID-19 PPEs. When he got rather excited and maybe I should say carried away. He told the president that his company had signed a 60 million drug supply deal with the government. Well, I knew from reading newspapers that Mr. Nguaya was a dodgy character. He had impersonated the police. He had once pretended to be an intelligence agent. He had been arrested for crimes ranging from extortion to possession of illegal sex-enhancing drugs. And so the question that I had when I was listening to that was, where did he get 60 million from? How is it possible that this shifty character ends up breathing the same air as the head of state? So when I began investigating, I would be introduced to the world of the Albanian mafia and their shelf companies, which they use to bid for contracts, typically in countries with weak systems, and Zimbabwe is one of those. Then they go on to reap some huge profits together with the corrupt political elites in those countries. In Zimbabwe, they found Mr. Nguaya, who is a family friend of the Mnangagwas. He has attended dinners and traveled the world with them. We discovered that drugs had hugely inflated invoices, which were approved by then Health Minister Obadiah Moyo, would be eventually fired and arrested on corruption charges based on the work that I had done. I have no doubt in my mind that nothing will happen to Moyo or Nguaya, by the way. They were just fronts for the powerful owners of this actual money, the 60 million that was being spirited out of Zimbabwe into accounts in Mauritius and Hungary. The government was eventually forced to cancel that contract. But Nguaya and his powerful friends, they have not forgiven myself and everyone else who took part in taking down this very corrupt enterprise. So they've come after my family, they've come after everything that I value, mainly my freedom. But they haven't stopped there. They've gone after two senior police officers who made the arrest. One of those police officers being the country liaison for Interpol, which was brought in after a suspicious 2 million payment was made to a bank account held by drugs in Hungary. Interpol got interested because drugs had only just registered 2 weeks before this amount of 2 million reflects in their account. So quite suspicious. Anyway, they didn't stop by just arresting the police officers who actually arrested the corrupt guys. They've gone on and arrested fellow journalist Paul Chinono, with whom I collaborated as the story developed. They broke down a door to his home, snatched him at gunpoint. He spent 42 days in Zimbabwe's most notorious prison. Again, in his case, the charge was creatively called incitement of violence. The central theme of these raids on both our homes was the interest of the state agents, their interest in our electronic gadgets. They took my laptop. In Chinono's case, it was his phone, a laptop, and a video camera. I have no doubt that they were fishing for my sources to find out who had shared confidential government communications with myself. The crime is not what is written on their warrants. Certainly, it's the crime is embarrassing the president and his family. And so this past week, I came across a high-level security document which has been leaked, and I've been able to corroborate its contents with the help of some security experts. It was generated in August this year. It lists me and many other journalists. It says I'm one of the individuals working against and sabotaging the government of Zimbabwe. And the document goes on to accuse me of using ZimLive to spread false allegations on human rights abuses and campaigning for the removal of the government through violent demonstrations. It concludes by saying that my whereabouts are unknown, which can only be understood to mean that they've been actively looking for me. The concern, of course, is what happens when they do find me. Will I be abducted and disappeared like my nephew, Tawanda Mchehiwa? Or will I be taken to a tough prison for more than a month while bail is refused? So those are the issues that I daily have to wake up and think about. And it's just been a terrible year for journalists in Zimbabwe. There's a government in charge that pays lip service to corruption and human rights, driven by the paranoia and aversion to critical journalism. They resort to using security forces to silence not just us journalists, but also political dissidents. And in a cruel way, the COVID-19 pandemic and the indefinite lockdown imposed since March has allowed them to use those emergency regulations to narrow the space even further for a free press. I checked with the Zimbabwe Union of Journalists just before this meeting, and I was told that between March and October this year, 30 journalists have been arrested or have been beaten by security forces. 30. And this is in peacetime Zimbabwe. Just think about that. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Nduduzi. Let's see whether we'll still have issues in terms of sound with Mateus. Mateus, over to you. Oh dear, Mateus, we're still unable to hear you. This is awful. We really wanted an opportunity to hear what you had to say. I'm afraid, Mateus, I hopefully you do have a copy of your speech, and what we can do is ensure that we do make it available on the website, I think. All right, so before I move on to questions, please, just one other thing. I just want you all to look out on October 28th for our annual impunity report. And that's when it's all about when journalists are killed and their killers walk free. And then also please join us on November 19 for our annual International Press Freedom Awards. Obviously, this year it will be a virtual event. And one of the 4 honorees is someone that I think most investigative journalists on our continent actually know. It's the Premium Times Dapo Olusegun Yomi. And then just also note that towards the end of the year, sometime in December, we will be releasing our annual census of jailed journalists around the world, as well as a report on the number of journalists that have been killed in connection to their work. And now we have a couple of minutes. I've been told we may have a few extra minutes. So let me go straight to questions. And I think I'll pose the first one to Lina. Lina, in the book Arrows of Rain by a Nigerian writer called Obe Ndibe, a grandmother tells her journalist son that a story that must be told never forgives silence. So I wonder, however, whether you believe that there are times that you should self-censor especially since you're one of the few remaining independent news outlets in Egypt, and that you'd rather actually be silenced, you'd rather be publishing than be silenced altogether?
Thank you, Angela, for this question. I always like to say that I'd rather the day when I will have to censor a story, even though I hope I have all what it takes to publish it in terms of sourcing and verification. I'd rather that this day when I decide not to publish that kind of story to be my last day in journalism. And for me, it's very clear that Mada is not so obsessed with its survival. It is more obsessed with being able to witness the present moment with all its hardships and to be able to write about them. So if this gives us weeks or months in existence, as opposed to years and decades, then this is what we would opt for in general.
Okay, thank you. Duduzi, yeah, I'm sure this is a question that you asked quite a lot, but let me do this. Would you say that things are better or worse for journalists under Mnangagwa than under Mugabe? And if so, why do you say this?
Well, I would say I don't remember a time or a year during Mr. Mugabe's reign that with so many journalists facing this kind of pressures that we are facing. I don't remember this intense campaign against journalists like we've noted under Mr. Mnangagwa. So he just came into power in November 2017. And the statistics are quite shocking. Between March and October, which is just 6 months and some few days, to hear that 30 journalists have been arrested or have been attacked by security forces, I think it takes a cup.
Ansbert, you paint a very bleak picture, and obviously it is bleak. There really isn't much independent journalism left in Tanzania. But what we have seen is that social media has been used to a great effect. But unfortunately, what we've seen certainly recently is that governments, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also elsewhere in the world, are actually using laws on social media to clamp down, right? And so that important space ahead of an election where you are hearing, where you do have voices, where journalists are able to put stuff out there, that is actually being shut down. And I'm not talking only about internet shutdowns, but I'm also talking about something that we've noticed that has started happening recently in Tanzania. And that is where you have hoax accounts who are suddenly reporting to Twitter violations of so-called copyright infringements. And in the process, you have these accounts that are closed down. And I'm told by some that there's apparently over 300 of these accounts in 24 hours that has been shut down. So I'm just wondering for you, what do you do in a situation like this? You were talking about, there being this vacuum. So who fills the vacuum?
Thank you, Angela. It's a very critical question. Because the vacuum, even as we were here talking, one of the journalists was following this discussion, and he sent me a message, a very brief one. He's telling me journalism is dead in Tanzania, and I totally agree with him. There is no serious journalism in Tanzania right now, but we don't have to despair. I think we should all be creative and find ways of doing the same thing in a different way. That's why I gave my own example when I was already in trouble and I was out of the country, and the government was cracking down on internet. I mean, you can't own a website in Tanzania right now. You can't own a YouTube account unless you have registered them with the government, and you register them after they've been approved by the same government, and sure you're not going to be approved unless they know what you're going to be writing about. And the best stories, as you know, the best is investigative stories are about the corruption that is committed by those in power. And who is in power? It's them. Who have the resources? It's them. Who are misusing them? It's them. So they are not going to allow you to investigate them. But we are trying to find ways across the border. And that's why I was appealing, more efforts on solidarity from across the border, because within the country it's really difficult. People are being hacked, and there's a lot of shoddy, stupid things that are happening in Tanzania right now. But I think we can feel the vacuum from outside Tanzania. Slowly they will change, because they never expected even to be this level of opposition that's right now in the election. But it's because of the work of the social media. Angela, you may remember how we rescued Eric Kabendera when he was abducted, when they had shut down all his phone numbers, and they thought he had no way to express himself or to communicate. But luckily enough, he had a line registered in the UK, so they didn't even know about it. They couldn't block it even if it did. That is the one he used to call people when they came to abduct him. So there is always life across the border, which could still save lives on the ground. And this is why I registered my SK Media, which is coordinating all like-minded journalists globally. It's not only on Tanzania. It is started in Tanzania, but it's going to be covering all issues of free press and democracy in the world. So whoever is interested, let's get together. Let's find new ideas, new approaches. The technology is changing day after day. And as far as I can see, much as they have the powers to suffocate us, I think we have the skills to circumvent their draconian approaches.
Thank you. Just one quick question before I hand over to Anton, who I'm sure will have other questions, but just to follow up, and I think Louis has asked, so, let's be realistic here. How can other journalists abroad help Tanzanian colleagues? What would you suggest they'd be able to do?
From my own experience, before some of us were in trouble and we shouted to the global world to listen to Tanzania. The global world knew less about Tanzania. They were not even interested. So the regime in Tanzania, ignorance of the world to do whatever they would do against their citizens. Right now, I can see an improvement. Western media following up issues on the ground. You report them in the media in the UK, in the Eurozone, in the US. The impact is very huge on the ground. So what we need to do is to have reliable sources in Tanzania. They could be local journalists themselves. It could be some civil society, all those actors in the fight against corruption. We use our journalistic skills to get the stories and publish them in other media outside Tanzania. They have a very huge impact when they are read by Tanzanians.
Thank you, and I'm really sorry time is up, but I know that Anton does want to ask a question or two, and then we'll be closing off. So just from my part and the part of the Committee to Protect Journalists, thank you very much. We have your back wherever we can, but thank you all, and over to Anton.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm going to wrap things up. We've had a very full hour. We've had a lot of information. You've asked some very good questions there. So I think that I'm just going to say a few wrap-up remarks. Through this conference, we have some remarkably good stories done in some African countries, investigative stories that have huge impact. What we are reminded of tonight is that there are other countries where conditions are really tough. And in somewhere it's impossible to do that kind of work. But what gives us hope is that we see tonight that there are brave journalists determined to do the work, and who with extraordinary courage take the risks and hold up that light and don't give up the battle for journalism, for investigative journalism, for holding power to account, for opening up these societies and playing this all-important role that we do as journalists and investigative journalists. So my first thank you goes to our speakers tonight for their work, for telling us their stories tonight, for reminding us of those situations, for telling us what needs to be done, and alerting us to that. Thank you very much to you. To Angela, I say thank you to the CPJ for your hard work in putting this together and your support and your cooperation. It's been great working with you. We have a long list of partners and sponsors, and they'll come up on the screen in a minute or two. We thank them all because none of this would happen without them. And we thank them for working with us through these difficult times to do the conference differently this year. I hope you have found it interesting. We have another full week of really very good sessions. So please go to the site, get the app, make your bookings, your reservations, and your registration for the other sessions coming up. There's still a lot to go before we wrap up in a week's time. So thank you all very much. And let's end on a note with us all thinking about the need for solidarity across the African continent among journalists working together to help, to defend, to assist, produce great work from this continent. Thank you very much and good night.